Hello there, friends. I'm Al, and I hold shift on a Frio. And I am not capturing your audio source for some reason. Hold on 1 minute, Mr. Andy. Mr. Andy, wait a second. I cannot hear you. Hold on. Don't look at me like that. Wait, where? Wait. I found the problem. Wait.
Happening.
Wait.
Am I here?
Say something.
Hello?
Yes,
Hello?
we got him.
Oh,
Say,
oh, man.
what's your name? Tell us that over
My
your name
name is...
again.
Hi, I'm Andy Proper Neckrich, and I have a voice.
He does have a voice. This is the Defuse. A little bit of a hiccup here as our normal producer, Mr. J Pistachio, got his wisdom teeth taken out. All 4 of them. Rough, man. But I've always been told that if you're gonna get your wisdom teeth taken out, get them all out at the same time, because otherwise it just gets to be an absolute disaster, and nobody wants that. Absolutely nobody wants. But this is, of course, the Defuse. We're going to be recapping through everything that happened at the CDL London Royal Ravens home series, giving you guys a frame up of what happens in Toronto, and of course, the biggest hot topic: what are the implications for everybody going in playoffs? A lot to talk about here, Mr. Proper. Let's jump into the most unlikely semifinal of the CDL 2020 season. London Royal Ravens played up against the Paris Legion in a matchup that, let's be honest, no one expected this to happen. And it was one that I don't think we were surprised was close, but it was one of those that I think we were a little bit surprised how close it was, considering that London actually had almost every single one of their favorite map mode combinations through the series.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go back and you just look at the overall stats throughout the entirety of that semifinal, then you would sit there and not be surprised by any means, because they are very comfortable on every single one of those maps. But even more so when you are looking at these overall stats, London actually outslayed Paris, which is why it felt like this was incredibly close. Paris were able to pull out some deep diving strategies that they were able to use against New York subliners to find themselves in the semifinals. But the slaying factor just wasn't there for them, which is, again, why this was incredibly close in a very handshaky fashion going to a round 11 map 5.
The round 11, I think, was the most impressive thing for me, because for Paris, how many times did we talk about Paris' search and destroy at the early and mid parts of the season, saying, man, I'll tell you, they're this close to locking in some of these searches. They find themselves up 4-2, 5-1, and then they end up finding ways to lose maps. That wasn't the case this time around. It was a round 11 map 2, a round 11 map 5, and both of them, they actually had to clutch up 2 or 3 rounds in a row, which I think was the more incredible thing, is, like you mentioned, Paris is able to find themselves the 3-2 victory in total. And for this, it now means that Paris has found a way to take the European head-to-head. They find themselves in a 2-1 head-to-head record versus London, so they are technically the best team in Europe, if you want to call it that. Although I kind of put a little bit of an asterisk next to that, because let's be honest,
They're statistically the best team in Europe.
Head-to-head only, they're the best team in Europe right now.
I mean, like, even for, like, I'm glad that you brought up those round 11s too, because I mean, you bring yourself back to Arklov Peak, the second map that was played in that series. They were down, I think it was like 5-3 or something like that, and Paris were able to clutch up. I say that again with a few asterisks behind it. London also really dropped the ball, and that especially in a round 11 when they had a distinct numbers advantage. I think it was like a 4v3 or something like that, but Paris still find a rotation through the middle of the map. London completely misread the entire situation, and it's not like Paris's setup was all too crazy. They just took down London one by one. It seemed that London Royal Ravens, that when the pressure was on them through this entire semifinal, it's just their controller slipped, or they just could not find themselves in a team-oriented fashion to really come up on top of their odds.
Here's the interesting stat line for the London Royal Ravens. They are a 50% win rate in hardpoint, a 50% win rate in search, and they're still pretty atrocious in domination. But are we finally at the point where we're going to stop attributing the London Royal Ravens as being an incredible search and destroy team? Because it's at the beginning of the year, it was Wuskin is the best sniper in the game, and he's still the best sniper in the game.
Facts.
And we turned around from saying, all right, Wuskin's the best sniper in the game. That means London is a very good search and destroy team. And then we transitioned to Wuskin's the best sniper in the game. Does he have to find picks for London to win? And now we're to a position where Wuskin is still finding snipes, but London is still losing search and destroys. Over the last handful, they've only won 4 of their last 10 search and destroy matchups.
Yeah, and even heading in towards the rest of the series after Arklov Peak, I think they're like 1-7 now in round 11s on search and destroy.
Yes,
so it's
good stat. Good stat.
It's really just not impressive. It's something that you don't write home about. I mean, even just take the simple fact from that last search and destroy that was played versus Paris, 1.86 KD for Wuskin. Who was right behind them at a 1.71 was Johnny. hold your horses because you can take a look at the rest of the hard point of domination for Shawnee. It's not impressive, but then you have Scraps dropping a 0.60, 0.78 for Dylan, and it's just not, again, something you write home about throughout the entirety of this specific semifinal. But then you go back to some other regular played matches earlier on in the bracket before we were talking about elimination or even bringing yourself towards Championship Sunday. Those numbers don't exist. It has to be something to do with pressure for London Royal Ravens to find themselves in this spot because again, we can keep on talking about them how they have a very strong search game, how Weskin is the best sniper in the game, yes, but at the same point in time, if you can't show up when the time really matters, what are you going to do come champs?
Well, here's the other thing about the search and destroy for London. They're 7-4 now in Arklov Peak. They're 6-4 in Gunrunner. Everything else, 3-5 Piccadilly, 1-1 on Ramaza, 1-4 on Petro. So they've got 2 maps that they play. And that's why I was talking about before, saying that London Royal Ravens felt like they really did win the map picking process because they got almost every single map that they wanted to, but especially when it comes down to their strongest search and destroys. But again, the result,
this was their series to lose.
Yeah, it absolutely was their series to lose. And I think, there were London fans out there that said that they choked and everything like that. And I guess technically you can make that argument. But regardless, Paris takes the edge over this battle for Europe as they take it 2-1 in the head-to-head, 7-5 in maps, which is definitely interesting to see. Coming up next, though, of course, our other semifinal was the Florida Mutineers going up against the Dallas Empire. And you might notice that there's no B-roll video going on right now because, honestly, the set didn't last long enough for me to clip any plays.
It was an impressive outing for Dallas Empire on Championship Sunday. Dallas Empire came here this weekend, and they showed up, and they knocked every bit of competition out of the park. You have an impressive outing for Crimsix, being able to look very comfortable with that AR in hand. And earlier on in the season, we said the same thing about that MP5. Fantastic flex player, but then you also have the likes of Illy just going absolutely bonkers and a lot of different outings on this entire map. The SMG presence for this team has not gone anywhere, but since the current patch that we're playing on with all the GAs included 10 millimeters, the ARs between Clay and Crimsix have only gotten stronger, and you're able to see just that. But then you could also take it on the other side. It wasn't an impressive outing for Florida. You could see the disappointment in their faces every single time that we went back towards the player cameras in between the maps. They just didn't look like themselves on the battlefield, nor inside those player cameras. Those numbers from Awakening did not match what we had seen from previous weekends, and especially against the Dallas Empire.
For me, let's be honest here. 6-1 on Piccadilly was an absolute thrashing. The 176 to 152 on Hacking Dom was a thrashing. And you might sit there and say, well, the Gunrunner was relatively close. But the only reason why the Gunrunner hardpoint was close was because Florida was getting blessed with some spawns that they had no business getting. It was an absolute insane kind of experience watching where they were spawning through and through. But that kind of brings us to our next point here. For Florida, based on their performance, not just here, but in the weekend as whole, are you at all concerned about, is this team going to be able to still compete with the top 3 squads, really at this point now, above them in the overall standings?
I don't have any deep concerns for them. I think that everybody has an off day. You just hope that for Florida Mutineers that your off day doesn't come champs. And it definitely doesn't come towards Toronto, to the Toronto home series, I should say, because you are starting off in Group B versus Dallas, and then say you win that and you go up against Atlanta, or even if you lose that, you go up against Minnesota, that you'll probably end up facing another big team again. This entire Group B heading into Toronto is going to be quite literally stacked. So, I mean, they got to be able to wipe their brows clean because you only have, what is it now, just about 5 days before that event even starts. So you better hope that was just an off weekend for them. But for me personally, I don't have any deep concerns for Florida Mutineers. I think that this was quite a tough weekend, quite a tough Sunday for some of the likes of Florida Mutineers. I mean, even the broadcasters throughout the entirety of the weekend of CDL, they were gassing up how strong Skies is, as I would still sit here and argue as the best AR in the league. Awakening, one of the best rookies to come into the scene and being able to make their presence known in the Florida Mutineers. But then you also had Pharaoh not finding the same value on the flanks. Frosty couldn't turn 1v3s in their favor. Havoc wasn't able to, wreak havoc in towards the middle of the map. We were talking about that as we were watching Piccadilly, and it's just one of those things that you got to be concerned with for Florida, maybe. But I'm also just going to stick by my guts check, and I'm just going to sit there and say that it was a very off Sunday for them. Dallas Empire, they looked good, yes, but it was not the same Florida Mutineers that we had seen in their previous 2 championship runs.
I'm not nearly as concerned about Florida as I am impressed with what Dallas was able to do. The only reason why I kind of frame up the potential for concern is because they do drop that map 5 versus the London Royal Ravens. trying to get out of their own group. And then beyond that, all they played was Optic Gaming, of which one of those 2 matchups also went to map number 5. There are some concerns, I think, as far as what they looked like in June versus what they looked like here, obviously, because there is a difference between those two. But that all said, I still don't think that there is any panic kind of being set in for the Florida Mutineers at the moment. For the most part, your losses, especially on domination, were pretty darn close. And outside of really one hard point, they held everything relatively close there as well, where one thing goes your way, you probably end up winning some of those maps versus like the London Royal Ravens or Optic when you played them in both instances. So for me, I'm just kind of thinking rehearsal-wise, can you get more improvement done? I was talking about it in my power rankings video. For the Florida Mutineers, they're in a position to where, yes, they were on the top. They were the best team in the game. But since the meta change and over the last 2-3 weeks, we've seen incredible improvements overall. Not just individually off of, I just swapped from an MP5 to an M4, but overall, we've seen stark improvements from Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta. Now we're in a position to where we need to see that for Florida before I can really sit there and say that, yes, they are still 100% either the best team of the game or even potentially a top 2 team in the game right now.
And who's to say that they weren't taking their scrim time and being able to try to influence that against a more stronger opponent like the Dallas Empire? There was that conversation for Atlanta that we were always sitting there questioning in their previous outing of that one weekend. We were like, well, they are not that good on this map, but it was also just because they wanted to practice against some tougher opponents on some maps that they're not necessarily strong on. You can't say that necessarily about Florida because, again, I mean, when you go towards some of these maps, they are quite strong on them, yes, but at the same point in time, you got to be looking at some of the different positions that they were taking. It just, again, it was not the same take that we were expecting for Florida to have, such on the likes of Piccadilly, especially. I kept on wanting to watch it and just had my eyes dead beat in the middle of buses, and I was always expecting Havoc to try to just work his way through there with Frosty on the other side and Skies looking over their shoulder to find that influence that we know that they always did, but they always got milliwapped. Illy in that exact moment dropped a 9-1 KD ratio. So it's just one of those
scope too.
Exactly. So it was just maybe they were trying something a little bit too risky, and maybe they might be able to pull themselves back come Toronto to fall back in towards their grace or learn from these mistakes to know that that's not something that they could do.
And the other hand, too, I mean, for Piccadilly, it is one of Dallas's best search and destroy maps, and Dallas is one of the best search and destroy teams in the game. So you can't really take too much away, I think, from that all in all. Speaking of Dallas, though, their series going up against the Paris Legion definitely provided some interesting insight, as we thought for maybe a second Paris could compete, considering that they did play them close the first time that they went in. But those considerations were short-lived as Dallas came out and absolutely smoked this grand finals, a 3-0 once again, including another 6-1 on Search and Destroy, another dominating performance on Domination itself. And the only real thing that they really kind of had some concern for was maybe part of that hard point. But again, a very small moment where we thought Paris was going to hold themselves in that because the slaying power of Dallas was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I alluded to this point earlier when we were talking about the semifinals between London and Paris, is that the slaying factor for Paris just wasn't there. I mean, I think that the biggest killer of them all was, I believe, was Luca, just because they went absolutely off the rails in that last search and destroy for their semifinals. But once you get over towards the overall in between Dallas and Paris, well, yeah, I mean, the slaying factor was literally non-existent. The overall KDs were just not necessarily something you write home about. It was something that you go back to, and it falls under the line of Paris that Dens was probably the most leading slayer for this team in the grand finals. But also, Dallas Empire, they were in top form this entire weekend. I believe that they only ended up dropping a single map throughout single map, and that was to Paris, and it was that opening first search and destroy that they played in the beginning of the Friday. But it's still, when you're going up against a championship caliber team like Dallas Empire for Paris Legion, this then brings my woes, is that Paris Legion, they were kind of gifted that semifinal victory. I'll go ahead and I'll join the masses in saying that London Royal Ravens did in fact choke that. And that Paris Legion coming in towards this grand finals had no need to be here, in my opinion. We probably would have gotten a better grand finals if it was London Royal Ravens, but still, Dallas Empire absolutely shut the lights out this entire weekend.
I don't know, man. I don't know if the grand finals would have been any closer if Dallas were to have played up against London. They had everybody's number this weekend. Absolutely. I mean, their search and destroy was the best that we've seen it all year long, with, again, like you mentioned, the exception being that Friday matchup versus the Paris Legion. It might have been, but I don't think it would. I think it would have been another 3-0. I mean, the maps that were played, we saw just sheer perfection from Dallas all the way through. Perfect rotations coming out in just about every single hard point they played this weekend. Again, nothing was ever really threatening them at any point in time. The closest hard point game they had was 250 to 219, and the closest domination game they had was 176 to 152. And outside of the 3-6 loss, the other 3 search and destroys were pretty comfortable, including 2 6-1s. They were the definition of dominant. And, you know, looking back at how Crimsix kind of tallied off that last interview, he was talking about when they were trying to get better, he literally went out there and asked everyone, are you playing the best Call of Duty? Like, are you at your peak right now playing your best Call of Duty, or could you be better? And not a single person said they were playing their best Call of Duty. Now that you've gotten to an opportunity where I think a lot of people could walk away saying that last weekend was my best Call of Duty yet, you have to look forward to the fact that you only played Paris, New York, and Florida. Now you've got to go into a pool where you have to play Florida again with more practice and the Atlanta phase. And then on the other side, you've got the Chicago Huntsmen waiting for you. And as you take a look at the stat lines, the Empire are 1-4 versus Atlanta. They're 1-3 versus Chicago. So this upcoming weekend, I think, is really going to be the true test for these guys, even though they do win their 3rd championship this last weekend.
And even overall in the standings, it's only a 10-point deficit between 1st and 2nd for Atlanta and Dallas. You know that Atlanta want to be able to walk in towards champs in that 1st seed and want to be able to feel relatively comfortable for themselves too. And beating Dallas Empire will be able to solidify them at that exact moment too, or even if they meet Florida as well. I mean, I don't necessarily see a world when we go to the Toronto home series that Atlanta FaZe don't absolutely show up, that they're probably done playing around on maps that they're not necessarily comfortable on.
Sure,
They know where their strengths are at, that they know where to ban and veto, and they know exactly where to take themselves. But versus Dallas Empire on the up and up, maybe this is the best Call of Duty that they're playing. You could probably make that argument. They were able to look that strong this weekend. But again, like you said, the numbers versus Chicago Huntsmen, the numbers versus Atlanta FaZe, they're not definitive enough for me to sit there and say that they can absolutely walk away with a back-to-back championship run.
I'm right there with you. And on the other side, talking about Paris, they obviously raised their stocks pretty high, at least in the standings. I think the conversation as far as, oh, is this team, now a top 6 team in the league? No, I don't think anyone's sitting there and saying that, even though they make the grand finals. It was a pretty soft run for them. Like we mentioned, they played Dallas close the first time. And yeah, you get a 3-0 versus a pretty vulnerable New York Subliners squad. But outside of that, all you had to do is beat London to get through. In my mind, Paris has now shown that they can beat regularly the teams that are listed below them in the standings currently, and they have a pretty decent opportunity with an improved search and destroy to beat teams that are above them. But for me, it's mostly just looking at they did what they needed to do this weekend, get to the playoff and get to a grand final to put yourselves in a position to where you are, in fact, looking at right now a 6th to 8th seed. Of course, they're not playing this upcoming Toronto home series. They're going to be sitting on the sidelines rooting for teams to lose, essentially. But for them to get out of what was a tie for really 10th place, to be now in a very considerable spot at 8th, where Optic or Toronto would have to put together a miraculous weekend, you got to feel pretty good about what Paris is able to show us under the last outing for the regular season.
They're going to be looking at Group B too. They're going to be keeping their close eyes on Minnesota, just to hopefully just lose all of those matchups too. That the Kryptonite has truly been locked away in a very padlocked cave that Atlanta won't be able to be phased by anymore, pun intended. I know, right? But you also have the same point in time. I just want to go double back on a point that I brought up earlier, is that versus you brought up a shaky New York Subliners match that Paris were able to walk away from, and being able to beat out London Royal Ravens. Although I said that they were gifted because London had choked a few different situations. But what is still a bright spot for Paris is that they're able to capitalize on a lot of those on their opponent mistakes too. And that's what you definitely have hopes for if you are a fan of Paris Legion, is that they are able to at least being able to capitalize on a lot of those mistakes that are right in front of them. So, I mean, when you are going up against a stronger team, I think that it just comes down to literally that slaying factor. But still, nevertheless, here, Shift, I don't think that Paris are necessarily on the rise. I will agree with you on that. But I mean, still right in the middle pack of the entire standings, and between these 12 teams, being able to beat Optic LA, absolutely. Will they be able to beat Toronto Ultra? That's going to have to be. I still need to be able to see that. I honestly think that it would be a really close matchup between them and Minnesota Rocker. But versus New York Subliners, I don't think that it'll ever happen again. versus those top 4 teams, those shift. I don't ever see them being beating Atlanta, Dallas, Chicago, or Florida.
I'm right there with you. I think the good news is you look at Paris to potentially make a little bit of a run when it comes to playoffs is the fact that their search and destroy has gotten better. And when you look at all the teams that are currently around them in the standings that they might be able to play, most of those squads have pretty atrocious search and destroy. So if you can just live off of winning both searches and then just taking a respawn, you should be in a good position. But that said, how many times have we said that about the Los Angeles Guerrillas and then they come out looking absolutely flat in search and destroy? It's definitely a risky place. There's a lot of improvement that still needs to happen. But like we mentioned, Paris does exactly what they need to get into a position to potentially make it out of that bottom 4, which of course brings us to next weekend. Before we talk about playoff implications, let's again talk about what the Toronto weekend will look like, where the top 4 teams currently in the standings will be there all in full force, 3 of which are in the same group. The only exception being Chicago, who plays up against Seattle first, and then Toronto has a very important matchup versus Optic Gaming LA in Group A. But as you were kind of framing up, Atlanta, Minnesota first, and then a rematch between Florida and Dallas. Which of those first opening matchups are you most looking forward to?
I'm honestly looking forward towards the Florida Dallas one. I know probably nobody was surprised. I think everybody's probably looking forward to that, whether or not Florida could have a resurgence. But if you want to know the other side of it as well, I'm actually looking forward towards the Toronto OGLA matchup from Group A. Personally, I could really care less about the Chicago Seattle one. I think I already know how that one's going to go. But Toronto OGLA, I really want to see the continue. Yeah, exactly, the 3-0 fashion. Thank you, Shift. I definitely want to see how well Hollow continues to adapt with this Optic squad. Whether or not Slasher gets milliwapped versus Toronto, but still, nevertheless, Toronto is still on the up and up. This is their home series after all, and you never want to count out a team at their home series.
And again, I think there's a lot of inspiration behind what Paris just did. Coming through and being an unexpected squad to make it to the playoffs, let alone the grand finals, and be able to do it with maybe a little bit of luck because they did face up against just London. But still, there is, I think, a showcase being put on that, hey, if you need to make something happen, you just get the work done, you move forward, and hopefully you can surprise some people. Early predictions for you, though, as far as, who's coming out of which group. Personally, I've got Chicago, Toronto coming out of Group A, and then I've got Atlanta and Dallas coming out of Group B. I know it's a little bit of a shocker because, again, between Atlanta, Florida, and Dallas, any of those 3 can make it, but only 2 can. What are your current picks to get out and make it into the playoffs?
I actually have Optic coming out instead of Toronto. Okay. I think that Draza and Hollow were definitely able to showcase their abilities this previous weekend, and those 2 individuals you've seen through challengers are always going to get better, and they have a lot of veterans that they're able to help them out with that, especially in Slasher and Kenny. But still,
Kenny was good this last weekend too. He played well.
Kenny really did. Yeah, I think that there's probably one consistent player that you have from Optic coming out from this previous weekend. It was definitely Kenny, Quavo, whichever name that you know them by at this point. I'm still going to call them Kenny regardless. But Chicago definitely comes out of this group. I actually have Atlanta and Dallas coming out as well. I really want to root for Florida. I'm a big Florida Mutineers fan. I want to sit here and I'll always put my pom-poms in my hand and I'll root for Awakening and Caesar Skies to absolutely pop off. But Dallas are in a different form. They're in a different beast right now, man. And like when you have Illy just having their way in search and destroy, their scope looks very clean. Like I was mentioning earlier, Crimsix and Clay, those ARs, because of the current meta that we are playing in right now, are only going to be able to make the SMGs look that much better. They're finding consistent space for Hugh and Shotzi and Illy, all to make their presence known, their young presence known on the map. But definitely don't see Minnesota beating any of these teams in that entire group.
I can't see it either. As much as I would love to see Minnesota,
I would love to see it too.
I just don't think it's gonna happen, man.
It's not gonna happen. No way.
Not looking good at all. That of course brings us to the next conversation point. Again, there's a lot riding on this weekend on multiple fronts. The first one being, of those teams you see, the top 4. Any single one of them could still finish in first place. The gap is that tight. Atlanta at 250, Chicago at 240, or pardon me, Dallas at 240, and then Chicago and Florida tied at 220, of which the tiebreaker is currently being held by the Florida Mutineers because they are 3-0 versus the Chicago Huntsmen, which is an interesting stat line. But there's a lot that rides on this one. And for really the easy way to kind of frame it up as far as what are you looking for, you can lock first place if you win the event. And I think we're looking at which of these 4 teams will win the event, because I don't think we're really making too much of an argument for anybody else. Maybe Toronto, but we have not seen them really have that strong of a performance versus any of these 4 teams previously. So it really comes down to which of these 4 teams wins And if they win, do they secure the number 1 seed? The only ones who would have questions about that are the Florida Mutineers in Chicago, who would need a little bit of help from Atlanta to not make playoffs or not make the grand finals to make sure they do secure that number 1 spot.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in an alternate universe is that Minnesota does beat Atlanta, right? And somehow, some way, they meet Florida in the losers bracket, and then they don't end up getting there too. Florida have a lot more riding off this entire Group B than rather than just fighting for first place because they don't want to go drop down and they want to be able to surpass Chicago Huntsmen. I mean,
Right.
is there also that alternate reality where they're able to beat Dallas and Atlanta facing the weekend? Absolutely. We have seen it before. Florida Mutineers are a team that can take it towards Atlanta FaZe and Dallas Empire, but is that this weekend? More than likely not.
Yeah.
But Florida Mutineers definitely have an opportunity to make an outing per se. But for Chicago Huntsmen, when you do meet Dallas Empire or Atlanta FaZe on Championship Sunday, will you be able to have all the marbles in your bag to be able to trip them up and being able to win? I'm not necessarily certain of that one either. But Dallas Empire versus Atlanta FaZe, I honestly, it's really tough for me to sit here and say this, especially, I mean, that I do like Atlanta. Dallas Empire will more than likely be able to surpass first place, especially if they play lights out like they did this previous weekend. Although they didn't necessarily face some of the strongest opponents in their strongest outings, I think that this meta definitely favors them a whole lot more than it favored Atlanta FaZe in Atlanta's previous outing, though they were playing on maps that they weren't necessarily comfortable on. They didn't have the biggest win ratios on them. You could just see the comfort coming through from Dallas versus Atlanta. Ever since we come online, Dallas has been on a very steady incline.
Yeah.
Atlanta hit their peak, but they've been rather static ever since.
This just comes down to could it be easy again put together another special performance to help them get over these hurdles of these major teams. But the destiny is pretty established for Atlanta. You make a grand finals, even if you don't win it, if you make that grand finals, you're going to secure at least top 2, if not the top 1 spot, depending if Dallas gets there or not. Again, just the math alone, if you're Chicago or Florida, your best win condition of getting the number 1 seed is that Atlanta does not make the playoffs. So if you're rooting for one of those 2 teams, that's what you're looking for. In the other front, though, the New York Subliners are not playing, obviously, this upcoming weekend. They have pretty much locked the 5th position. The only way that New York gets knocked out of the 5th spot is if the Minnesota Rocker make the finals, and let's be honest, we're not that hopeful that that's going to happen.
Alternate universes exist. Maybe we walk through a door and come this weekend for the Toronto home series, and Minnesota absolutely pops off. I mean, it seemed looked really good in their previous weekend, but and we talked about it in an episode of the Defuse. Actually, is that Alex has not necessarily been able to showcase their ability to play the game as once as we saw them. Silly is not necessarily being able to be that player on that team that we expect, and there's just a lot that you have to be concerned with, especially for Minnesota Rocker. I mean. Maybe you have Assault go off. Maybe God or X just absolutely pops off, but you're mostly looking towards the seam to be that star-studded player. And I'm not going to lie, I don't think that it's just going to be able to come down to one, especially in that Group B as well, just to make yourself a guarantee to make yourself there on Sunday. Because you lose to Atlanta, you're probably facing Florida. You beat Atlanta, you're probably facing Dallas or Florida. It doesn't necessarily matter. You're probably not going to make it.
You're still playing up against top 4 squad. And that is a good point.
It just really sucks to be a Minnesota fan and look at this bracket.
Does.
You're just like, what do we do? What do we do here?
For Minnesota, though, if they do win one matchup, they will actually surpass the London Royal Ravens. But there's really no way, and I don't think that's mathematically even possible for them to drop out of that middle 8, or that middle 4, rather. So there's really no way that they finish in the bottom 4. Of course, the Paris Legion are not necessarily safe, and they're going to be rooting up against both Optic Gaming LA. Really, first, you're rooting up against Optic Gaming LA, and then you're rooting for Toronto to not win the entire series, and Paris will lock themselves a top 8 position and staying out of losers round 1, which brings us to that very pivotal matchup. Optic Gaming LA and Toronto Ultra, 9th and 10th, 80 points and 70 points, respectively. Optic Gaming technically holds the tiebreaker versus Paris, if I'm not mistaken. So, if OGLA make the playoffs and Toronto does not go further than Optic, they could break into the top 8. Whereas for the Toronto Ultra, they essentially have to win the entire event and hope that Optic Gaming LA does not make the finals. Are you going with me, or is your mind working in webs right now?
I'm there. I'm not necessarily certain how strong these webs that you're spinning are.
They're thin, brother. They're thin.
They're silky thin for sure. I mean, like Toronto winning the entire event, it's a hell of a condition, especially when you're gonna have to see if. Say you do beat Optic, right? And it is very likely to have happened, though I know that Visions is probably cringing at the fact that I did pick Optic to beat Toronto. you got to go up against Chicago.
Right.
Do I see Toronto beating Chicago? Absolutely not. But if you get knocked down to the losers bracket, could you make yourself in towards that qualification match where you're probably going to meet Optic again? I don't know, maybe they could be able to string together that match come Saturday. I don't necessarily see it happening. Toronto for me is also in that same drawer of inconsistency. I want to see Bants continue to pop off in this meta. They look very strong. Tobias coming in, Kleenex has been looking fantastic. But then you also have a lot of dark spots, whether or not we know if it's going to be Classic coming in, or if you're going to end up having medals. I have not seen any move on Twitter to whether or not it will be either of those two. I have a lot of questions for Toronto. All I can tell you is that you hope that your S&D is as strong as it once was so that maybe you can close out the map 5s.
Going forward, though, again, there's a lot to look forward to. It's one of those things that we're going to react to it as the results kind of come through. So a lot of things in the line, but just know that the top 4, anything can happen, although all 4 of those teams have locked a position in the top 4. It just comes down to who gets the top 2 seed and who finishes 3rd and 4th. And then on the bottom side, you're looking at Toronto and Optic to try to get out of that bottom 4 and try to surpass the Paris Legion. We will be moving on to talk questions for you guys. We've had a lot already come through, but of course, we're always open to taking more. You'll notice, I think, exclamation point giveaway, as Comp was very nice to edit it for us. There is a link to a Twitter status which has asked you guys to pose your questions, and if we choose your question here live on stream, you will get 5 CMG credits. Not a bad way to earn yourself some free Checkmate Gaming credits. So, looking at some of these, we've had a couple of good ones. Let's start with a new one on the block here. Jack Walker at JMWalker56 asks, following their victory, do you make Empire favorites for champs? And which team beyond that do you think has improved the most since the start of the season? Interesting question.
Now do I make Empire favorites for champs?
I'm
pretty sure that they were the favorite for champs about 2 weekends ago.
Really? You had them over Florida?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I did.
I had Florida better than Dallas 2 weeks ago, but
I mean, when Florida milliwatt a very weak Dallas, yes, but then 10 millimeter came right back into the mix, and you saw what that looked like this previous weekend. I believe that it was Merc that brought up this previous point as well, is that when you have the SMGs being able to find presence and the M4 was also buffed, yeah, Dallas Empire, I think that they're the clear-cut favorites for champs.
Yeah, I think right now they absolutely are. But like I mentioned, I'm not 100% sold on saying that, mostly because, yeah, they were able to go through Florida in 3-0 fashion with a Florida team that maybe got caught surprised by the meta just a touch, but they didn't really play anybody else. They played New York, sure, but even in that series, that was not a convincing win. Even though it was a 3-0, the maps were relatively close. So it's not like they're unbeatable, and I think when we see them play up against a team like Chicago, who's also looking like they're hitting their form, or a team like Atlanta who's showing consistent improvements, I think that there is still some wiggle room. But I think right now, after this weekend, it would be hard to deny how those 11 maps in a row looked for Dallas as far as them potentially being a favorite.
That one versus Atlanta is definitely the one. It's definitely the one that I'm mostly looking out for.
I'm hoping, and I'm kind of predicting now that the grand finals of both this upcoming weekend and playoffs is going to be Chicago versus Dallas. Those are my top 3 right now.
If the stars align, that's how I think a lot of us see that happening.
Fair enough. What about most improved team in your mind, though?
Most improved team
from the
champs?
From the start of the season, I assume either to now or to the end of the season. Who's your most improved team overall?
Probably the New York Subliners,
to
be honest with you.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the New York Subliners have been able to work their way from the bottom of the barrel all the way to 5th position, and that's a simple working of bringing in Mac flipping Melts, man. Mac Melts is the gold of this team of New York Subliners, and that only makes the rest of the team look that much better. You saw what that looked like when New York Subliners are in top form. Attached with the sniper has been impressive, to say the least. Even Zuma was be able to be right there with them too. Yeah, Temp has had some slow starts in Hardpoint, but then once the series starts to become a little bit warmed up, you start to see how all 5 of these members from New York Subliners are able to play the game. They are very impressive now.
Yeah, very good question for sure. Switching over to Harry's question, he asked, do you feel like Octane's ability is being wasted on this Surge team? Also, did the Ravens look stronger than what they did at the start of the season? I'm going to give just a yes and then a yes, both of those questions.
I'm gonna sit there and give you the double yes as well. I think. I mean, I'll give you some meat in that sandwich too, of the double yes sandwich. But I mean, Scraps has been able to look better since launch weekend. Zero coming into this team has definitely looked a lot better. I think even Shawnee Has some definitely some spots that they need to improve, mostly in their hard point. That's not Ramaza, but still, you have a lot of things you got to be looking at for London Royal Ravens. Apart from whether or not they're just stronger now, but I will sit there and just say double yes. I think
Yeah.
Octane definitely should be on a better team.
I mean, if he was on even a slightly better team, he would be single-handedly helping that team win games. Like if he was on a team even like Paris, for instance, or Toronto, his 30 plus kills a map on respawn would be enough.
Imagine them on Minnesota.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I actually quite like Minnesota Rockers' assault lineup, or like their AR lineup.
Sure.
With Assault and God RX. But yeah, I think that regardless, like any other team, maybe with the exception of like the Los Angeles Guerrillas, if he was, no, I would even say if he was even on the Los Angeles Guerrillas, that team would be winning more games than the Seattle Surge. Seattle Surge has so many problems right now, I think overall. But it's funny because like for me, like talking this through, like this is very much so like Russell Westbrook and like the OKC Thunder. Like when he went for his MVP run, like Russell Westbrook was the only reason why the Thunder were winning games that year. And that would be the same case with a team that even was just slightly better than where Seattle currently is. But when Seattle is the 11th best hardpoint team and the 12th best search and destroy team, the hell can you do? You're not going to win series of winning one domination.
Yeah, you have had multiple roster moves as well. You've been in a struggle bus probably since like the third weekend, and it's just very tough scenes because if there's one consistent factor that has coming out from Seattle Surge is that Octane can absolutely fry, and Octane is always sitting there dropping 30 plus kills and hard points and not necessarily finding the same value in the score line. Yes, Apathy had a pretty good outing in their search and destroy play this previous weekend, but that's just this previous weekend comparatively to the rest of the season. Could you only imagine if this team was more consistent in the early goings where they possibly could have been at, or if Octane was just on a different team? There's a lot of different alternate universes on this episode of The Defuse.
100% the case. It really is. Have you been watching the show Dark on Netflix?
No, I have not.
Okay, that's like if you get a chance, go watch it. It's actually really incredible. But there's a lot of mixed worlds and universes and timelines and stuff. And I don't know. I've been watching it, so my mind is still there. Going over to Ritual, he asked a good question here as well. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think it's good to hit this for our final question of the evening. Do you feel with how the Mutineers performed this weekend that they have gone through their honeymoon phase and are only as good as we saw them this weekend? Or was it just an off event?
I already said this earlier, so I'm going to stick by my point. This is a very off event for Florida Mutineers.
Right there with you.
I don't. It just doesn't really compute for me personally. I mean, again, like I'll just read you off some of the overall KDs. I mean, none of them broke over point even one. 0.92 was the leading one. That was Frosty. Skies dropped a 0.89 overall. And even throughout their domination, search and destroy, hardpoint, nothing really to write home about. I mean, again, like that search and destroy against Dallas Empire in the semifinals, I got absolutely millywop, so you can't ever really bring that up in the conversation when Frosty dropped a 0.14. But still in that hard point for a lot of different instances to where things might have been relatively close. 1-0 for Skies, 1.17 for Frosty, 1.08 for Pharaoh. But the biggest factoid here for me was Awakening. And Awakening coming in towards this Florida Mutineers team has been consistently popping off since they had first stepped in the CDL. They won their opening CDL weekend with the Florida Mutineers, and they've been dropping massive and very impressive numbers, continuing to find a lot of value in whatever position that they are taking on the map. And that influence just wasn't there this weekend. So I'm still going to stand by my point. This was a very off weekend for Florida.
Yeah, it looked like there was a little bit of a couple of pacing concerns. Skies maybe, getting a little bit more heavily challenged than he may have been used to, considering that there are more ARs on the field. But I'm going to consider this to be a quote-unquote off weekend, kind of a feeling out and figuring out weekend for them. I think that they'll come back next weekend looking a little bit stronger, especially versus Dallas, although I don't know if they'll be able to beat the Dallas Empire. I think they'll come out looking stronger against them than the very convincing 3-0 that they faced and suffered versus them. The other big question is when you play up against a team like Atlanta, which they very well may, are you going to be able to continue on that power that you had in June, where the SMGs of really, really good squads that you were playing up against were not finding impacts? You were able to beat the Atlanta FaZe not once but twice. You were able to beat the Dallas Empire not once but twice. And you were able to beat the New York Subliners just once. But still, it's one of those things that they were able to shut down the SMG lines of each of those teams every single time they played them. And I think that that's something that was lost this last weekend, considering that there were more ARs at the table. So Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think this is a little bit more of an off weekend, more than just a quote-unquote honeymoon phase. It obviously comes with weird coincidental timing because a meta change is also kind of occurred for us. A bit of a mixed bag, I guess, if you want to call it that, kind of rounding things out. But like we mentioned, that will round us out. We will be back, though, next weekend for the Toronto home series recaps every single day afterwards. So if you enjoy this style of content, make sure you follow along with the stream here. We also post these to YouTube in case you miss any of them in live time. So you can always check that out on our Checkmate Gaming YouTube channel. Proper, who you got winning next weekend? Closing thought.
Come on, man. Who do I got closing it out?
Yeah, who's winning? Not playoffs, but Toronto.
I've been sitting here just trying to shuffle back through Twitter. I've been trying to keep a close eye on Atlanta FaZe, whether or not they're streaming their scrims too, and I'm pretty sure that they're sticking with their same rollout. Who's going to be sticking on those SMGs? Who's picking up the final AR? But we haven't seen them with the 10mm coming back in towards the instance. Right now, in this current exact juncture, after seeing London home series, I will say Dallas will win it, but I wouldn't be surprised if Atlanta comes through and closes it out.
I've got a team going back to back, but I've got the Chicago Huntsmen going back to back. I think they're going to have that little spark, that little something to get through because they're going to have a little bit of an easier group. You can kind of work your way through no problem, and then as soon as you get to playoff Sunday, it's game time. Scump on playoff Sunday is going to pop. I know a lot of people are saying he's only getting 0.8s, blah, 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 but I think he's going to be filling in a very, very
influential 0.8s, though, keep in mind you.
Very influential 0.8s. That's going to do it for us, though, this weekend. We'll catch you guys back upcoming on Friday, Saturday, and probably another Monday episode to recap Toronto. So make sure you out there do not let that fuse fizzle out. Till next time, so long.